Last speaker in this morning's session is Larry Hunter, who's going to talk about artificial intelligence in medicine. I think it's a very appropriate topic because I've always felt that the intelligence claimed by most physicians is artificial. Sorry about that. Seriously, this is a very controversial topic, and I'm going to be very interested to hear what you say. I'm on both sides of it. I work with some companies trying to do this, and I have some close friends who don't believe it will ever work. So please inform us with your wisdom on this.
Thank you, Charlie. All right. I'm very grateful for both the last 8 years of this and everything I've learned and all the friends I've made and the community that you've created here. I think that of all the things about this, it's not just a club, it's a community, and it extends way beyond that. And I am very honored to be back here a second time to talk about something completely different than what I've talked about before. Yeah, okay, thanks. That's up high. I'm loud anyway. And so I want to take as a launching off point this New Yorker story from their Annals of Medicine issue last month by Sid Mukherjee, who is the guy who wrote Emperor of All Maladies and is a very, I think, good, deep thinker about issues in medicine generally. And he started off by quoting Jeff Hinton. Jeff Hinton is one of the founders of modern neural network theory. He's a really wonderful guy. He's a professor at the University of Toronto in computer science. And Jeff is kind of like most of you, he speaks his mind. And so he got invited to the University of Toronto Hospital to give a talk about this machine learning stuff and what it might mean for medicine. And he said to the audience, you guys are like Wile E. Coyote in the cartoon. You haven't looked down yet, okay? You all are the ground. There's no ground underneath you, okay? Deep learning systems are already better at understanding breast and heart imaging. There's developed commercial systems. It's completely obvious that in 5 years, deep learning is going to do better than physicians. And he ended up by saying, we should stop training radiologists now. Okay, you are doing a disservice to these kids in your classes by thinking that there's going to be jobs for you afterwards. And the reaction for that, as you might imagine, wasn't wonderful. And it was a learning experience for everybody involved. And Jeff ended up taking some of that back and saying, well, maybe radiologists do stuff other than just look at an image and try and tell you what it means. And maybe they're valuable for other reasons, and it might be okay to have a few of them around, but less of them. But he really, more or less, didn't take it back. And I want to expand on that a little bit and talk a little bit about how it could be useful in a productive way, all right? There's a lot of fear about how AI is going to take our jobs and do better than us at everything, and there's no point in having human beings on Jeopardy anymore, and it's not fun to watch, and there's no games left that they can't beat you at and stuff like that. And it turns out that that kind of fear is a mistake. We need to think about how AI can work with doctors, not against them or replace them. And my favorite example, and I picked this out because one of my good friends, Ronnie Wise, is in the audience, is an ophthalmologist. And it turns out that retinopathy screening for diabetic retinopathy is one of those things that we've trained a deep learning algorithm to do really well. Okay? It works about as well as the average ophthalmologist. And the reason that it's important is not that we can replace ophthalmologists. They're important on their own, not for doing retinopathy screening. But if we were going to really screen all the diabetics just in America for retinopathy every year the way we ought to, we would need to screen 34 million images a year. Okay, there's not enough docs to do that, and they cost too much. And we don't do it now just for cost purposes, okay? Technology is easy. So if we can use neural networks to at least pre-screen those and make things better in terms of getting people the care that they need by doing this in a low-cost way, then that's a good use of AI in medicine, and we should welcome that. And this is true all over the place, okay? So for doing skin lesions, for trying to do primary care on trying to identify skin lesions that need follow-up, it turns out that deep learning methods, and they don't just apply to images, I'll get to that in a second, are actually better than the average dermatologist and almost as good as the best dermatologist at picking these things out. And the nice thing about it is you can put this in your phone and you can take a picture of the thing that's bugging you and you can get back a pretty instant response that's pretty accurate that says you should go see a doctor or don't worry, just wear sunscreen. Okay, and so we should take advantage of this because this is an issue of equity and access to care. all right? There is a shortage of our ability to provide some of these basic screening services. And if deep learning systems and the phone in all of your pockets is able to do that, we should do that. It's not a threat to your jobs. It's not a threat to your value as human beings. It's something we ought to think about, how can we really do this? And it's not just imaging. Cardiovascular risk prediction algorithms that use routine clinical data now are substantially better than the AHA, American College of Cardiology risk scores, and better than Framingham risk or Q-risk2 or Reynolds or any of those things. We should use this machine learning stuff to take care of each other. But there's an important issue, and Mukherjee raises it really nicely in his paper. He talks about, and this is actually Hinton's metaphor, the difference between a physicist and a pitcher and their ability to tell where a ball is going to go. Okay, and pitcher has thrown the ball millions of times and knows exactly where it's going to land and can tell you, you want it to land here? I'll make it land there. But if you ask him why, pitcher has no idea. It's just because that's how I throw it, okay? It works there. That's why I do that. As opposed to a physicist who has a theory about why balls go the way that they do and what the forces acting on them are. And in the end, they are probably roughly equally accurate, okay? The physicists and the pitcher are both going to be right. But the physicists bring something extra to the table, okay? They bring a knowledge about why, what it is that allows the ball, that causes the ball to go there. And that turns out to be important in medicine. If you read Mukherjee's article, he'll show you all the different reasons, both for research purposes and for communicating with patients. There's a new regulation being promoted, I love this, in Europe, that says patients have a right to an explanation. Okay, so not only do you have a right to being treated properly, but you have a right to ask, why is that the proper treatment, and have it be explained to you. I think that's a lovely thing. We ought to consider it in our practices as well. But that's one of the problems with these deep learning AI systems. Okay, as you can see from the Tech Review cover about the dark secret of the heart of AI. I don't know if you can read the small print, but it says really nobody knows what these algorithms do. Okay, they are black boxes. They are pitchers. They see millions of examples, and they're really good at recognizing patterns. The sort of stuff that Casey just told you is a good example of that. And we have a few sort of methods around the edges where we can look at individual neurons in these neural networks and try and guess what that neuron is doing by lighting it up, and you get the sort of cat picture. And so it's, oh, let's recognizing cats. But it's really, in general, it's an extremely hard problem, and our systems are not very good for understanding what these networks are doing. And so now I want to pivot a little bit and talk about how important it is to actually understand why. And not that it's an inevitable failure of AI, it's just a failure of today's AI. And we might be able to solve that, and I think we might be able to solve it particularly well in this domain. So I want to give a little philosophical background, and there's 2,000 years of philosophy on this, but about what a theory of explanation has to do. What is it that knowing why means? And it's interesting because it's the ability to explain a consequence of a very broad causal theory. It has to be a causal theory of, let's call it, the world. And the reason that's the case is that a good explanation is not just the answer to the particular question that's being explained, but the answer, the explanation, increases the coherence of the entire belief system. An explanation is only a good explanation in the context of knowing a lot of other stuff that it might fit into or might not fit into. And that's really critical. It's a characteristic of the entire collection of knowledge, not of some particular answer to a particular question. Okay? And it turns out that philosophers are useful not only in this kind of knowing what an explanation is business, but in the heart of biology. Unlike, say, in physics, where what we're looking for is law-like behavior, in the heart of biology, what we're looking for is what scientists often call mechanisms. How is it that these different law-like phenomena fit together to do something, to account for some observed phenomena? Okay? And that account is what we as biologists do. We come up with mechanisms and test mechanisms. And that role of mechanistic explanation has driven some very interesting recent philosophy. The book I'm showing behind you by Carl Craver and Lindley Darden really lays out what it is that is different about the science that we biologists do that isn't the same scientists that physicists say do. And it's fun because, let's see, is there a pointer in this? Yes. I love this chapter here about the virtues and vices of different mechanistic proposals, okay? Mechanisms differ, different accounts of why something happened. You can have different problems, different advantages, and they're actually going back through the history of biology, we can find a set of criteria that we use for what counts as a better or worse mechanistic explanation, one that's better supported by the data or less supported by the data. And that's really critical. This is what it is that we do when we explain more broadly. It's not just explanation in biology, but it turns out biology is a particularly good place to look for characteristics of explanations and build automated systems for generating explanations. I want to take a brief sidelight to America's perhaps most famous and important philosopher and least comprehensible, Charles Sanders Peirce. He doesn't even pronounce his name right. And I have one quote. It's turgid stuff, and he wrote a ton of it. But I pulled out one of my favorite quotes of his. And he's talking about how we come up with our explanations. How is it that we come up with this idea of what the mechanism underlying some phenomena is? And he says it's not by any logic, okay? And that's clearly true. And we don't even understand how it works. And it's wrong most of the time. Our mechanistic hypotheses, our causal ideas about things are just terrible. But the fact that they work at all is really one of the most amazing things about human beings. And I love this quote. It's absolutely right. And we need to understand more about how that process works. And I'm a computer scientist trained in AI, so when I want to understand how a thought process works, I want to build a computational model of it. I want to know, can we build a computer program that can really know why about things? And now I just want to say a couple of things about what it would be. And I want to invoke Daniel Kahneman's wonderful work in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which I think many of you are familiar with, where he sort of talks about two different kinds of systems of knowing. And one of the things I love about explanation is it deeply involves both of those systems of knowing. One of those systems is fast and automatic and intuitive. It's just kind of what comes to mind, what Peirce was talking about this, uncritical logic, whatever it is. And the other is that putting it together with everything else you know and thinking about what the consequences of that would be. And that thinking slow part that's inherently symbolic and I'm going to call it logical, although not necessarily in the sense that mathematicians mean. And so those two things belong together critically to build a real theory of what explanation is going to be. But there's a deep challenge for building AI systems that can do explanation. And that is what all of you have, the only existence proofs we know, the only critters we know that can build explanations are people. And people start very early at this, okay? If you've had a toddler, you know about the why questions, endless why questions, okay? And children do that for a reason. There are evil psychologists who have tested this. If you give them nonsense answers, they stop asking. Okay, it's not just to engage in conversation, okay? It's not just to talk with you and get you to answer because they know you'll answer why questions. It's because they actually care about the answer to why questions. And they're building a coherent, remember I talked about an explanation has to fit in a coherent causal theory? 3-year-olds are building a coherent causal theory of the world. 13-year-olds are building a coherent causal theory of the social world. All that stuff is completely hidden from us. We know it, we use it, we rely on it. We call it common sense often, not in teenagers. But there's this kind of deep background that we have that makes it really hard to write computer programs to do that because there's no way to get that stuff into computer programs. Okay, so it's really, AI has not made a lot of progress on this problem. But molecular biology is particularly well suited for this because, first of all, mechanisms and mechanistic hypotheses and explanations are a crucial piece of what we do. And second, that background knowledge, that worldview that we have that encompasses everything we care about, none of that was stuff you learned as a 3-year-old or a 13-year-old. All of it comes from textbooks or journal publications, or these days maybe databases, and for a few of you, some of it comes from experiments you've done in your lab that you haven't shared yet, but by and large, there's no barrier to getting all of this stuff into a computer. And if we could get it all into a computer, then maybe we'd have a shot at building real explanatory theories. And so this is what the work in my lab has been about, and I want to tell you a little bit about how it's worked and what we do, but it's built on these sort of fundamental pieces of knowing what the things in the world are and how they connect with each other. And an awful lot of the work in molecular biology and computational molecular biology the last decade or two has been giving the foundation for doing this. So there's all this work in biomedical ontology. Many of you have probably heard of this. Ontology is an ancient philosophical approach to enumerating everything that is. And so biomedical ontology is about enumerating all the biological processes there are, or all the cell types there are, or all the sequence phenomena that there are. And we have a really good basis for that stuff now. We have decades of work. Judy Blake, sitting in the audience, has been responsible for a great deal of it, and a lot of other people, and it's brought in all kinds of experts to argue over stuff. Think of it as a nomenclature committee on steroids that covers everything, and it's really wonderful stuff. And so what we do is try to use that in a particular use case. What we're trying to do, a lot of computational biology has been about, sort of the stuff that Casey just described, has been about taking data from experiments and deriving some results from it. And what we're really focused on is once you have those results, we want to help you write the discussion section of your paper. Okay? What do these things mean? How do you interpret them? Why is it the case that? Those why questions, okay? And so we're focused on doing this for taking some result of some molecular experiment that identified a bunch of either genes or proteins or variants or metabolite concentrations or whatever they are that are related to some phenotype, and then take everything we know, that big background knowledge, and say, okay, how does that fit in? What's new about it? What's different about it? What's a possible explanation? What's the evidence for that explanation? What are some of the other explanations, and what are the evidence for those? Which one is better? And so that's what we're trying to do. And instead of trying to describe in technical detail how it is that we do this, I had Anson Adams, who is a college student who's incredibly talented, make this great video, which shows you sort of schematically how this works. So we start from these ontological descriptions. We start from the gene ontology, which I'm going to zoom in and show you some particular biological process and all of the processes sort of around it that it's part of or that it's a kind of. And then it's not just the process, it's also the proteins. So the proteins are all different from each other. We can use the protein ontology to specify things like which particular variant of it, which organism it's from. There's a whole bunch of copies of VEGF. And so we can link up the protein ontology to the gene ontology. But what we need to do is understand where it's coming from. So we use this information artifact ontology to say this is a database record, and this is a field in the database. And what that record means, denotes, is about, is a separate thing. So we can keep track of the difference between the things in a database or a paper, which are statements, and the things in biology, which are real things. We use all those different ontologies and put it together. And we put it together in such a way that we can take information out of all these different databases, which say very important and valuable things about all those stuff, and put it together in a coherent way. So if you look at UniProt, and this is VEGF and UniProt, it has a tremendous amount of information. Some of the gene ontology stuff, VEGF has actually 45 pages of database record for one protein in an enormous database of millions of proteins. And we want to take not just that, but things like pharmacogenomic variation, so differences in VEGF that make a difference in whether you should take or not take this drug. And that's big, too. And then reactome, what are the pathways that these things participate in? And that's big, too. And we can take all those stuff and use the ontological tools we've developed to represent all of those things. The first thing we represent is what's in the database. What is the database trying to tell you? And then we can transform that stuff first into the representation of what's trying to tell you. So ICE is information content entities. They're about records and field values and identifiers and the stuff you find in the databases. So we want to get that right, and then we can transform all of that stuff into a representation of what they mean, what they're about. And so we can say, okay, this says that these proteins and processes in the world affect this drug response, and we can build up a representation of all that stuff in all those databases and put it together in one unified format that is as close as we get to what biology has as a coherent theory. Databases are incomplete. We need to go to the literature, too, and find those references to ontological terms in sentences in the literature, represent those, and use natural language processing to try and fill in some of the gaps in our biological understanding. So that there are pieces missing we can add in and build a more complete understanding of this stuff. And there's a lot of this. Each paper is full of these things, and there's millions of papers, but computers are good at this stuff, okay? One of the reasons that the machine learning things are taking off right now is because we have so much computer power, and I think the symbolic things are ready to do too. Now, right now, our knowledge base can take some query that integrates information from multiple different databases. And you don't have to know which databases it's in or how it was stated, but we can plug the query against the knowledge base and get back out a good answer. Okay? And that's kind of the basis of how we're going to get to really explaining things. But this knowledge base exists, and it's been built by folks in my lab. I want to call out a bunch of them are here. So Bill Baumgartner and Elizabeth White, and I'll get to some of the others in just a minute. But this work is really valuable to us in that use case, but we want to use it to get to the ability to really explain things. So how are we going to get to not mansplaining or whatever, but AI-splaining? And we need to do several things to make this work. Okay? One of the most important things is representing what we don't know. So I just showed you how to represent things we do know. And we're fairly good at that at this point. All that ontological development has given us the knowledge representation tools we need to be able to write down everything that's known. But if you ask any scientist, what do you know about stuff? They'll tell you they know a lot of stuff. But that's really not what they're excited about. What they're excited about is what they don't know, but they think they might be able to find out. Oh, let me tell you about the experiment I'm working on now. Okay, let me tell you what we might be able to do in 10 years if we only built coals. Okay, we have this whole idea of what we don't know and characterizations of it and how we're going to get to those things that we know. So we have to be able to represent in a computational way what we're ignorant of. We also have to know what the kinds of mechanistic explanations that we use are. What are the successful ones? Because remember, it's about coherence of this large collection of knowledge. So we have to know what are the different kinds of mechanism explanations that have worked in science, have been adopted, how do they fit together? Do we have a library of them? We show a bunch of examples going from Hooke and circulation through yesterday's papers and come up with a generalized collection of patterns that these things do. The virtues and vices were of mechanism schemas in the Darden book, and those schemas are patterns of explanations. And so when we see certain kinds of phenomena, we can kind of guess, well, maybe this pattern will work. We can try those different patterns, find the right ones. And in order to be able to do that, we have to do the system 1 and system 2 thing. We have to use the machine learning methods to try and guess which patterns might be the most appropriate ones. And then we have to do this sort of more symbolic reasoning kind of thing to take what we know and plug them in and come up with an actual explanation for this particular observation. Now, this is all very ambitious, and nobody's done this. And I think maybe before I die, I will be able to write programs that do that, or at least that's my goal. But if we could do it, it would be tremendously useful at a bunch of different levels. So first of all, it would give us a deeper understanding of how people do it. And I think as we build systems to do it, we will see what's easy and what's hard. And if anything has been the use of computer science in connecting with biology, it has been changing our idea of what's easy and what's hard. Things that used to seem impossible are now you could do on your laptop, see Casey's talk last minute, and things that most people in the biological world think, oh, some computer program ought to do that. We should find some informatics guy to do that. Turns out to be wickedly difficult, say this. So we'll have a deeper understanding of it. But a more important thing is we'll have a new partner. Okay, so if you think about what AI is going to do, it's not going to take away all of our jobs. It's not going to replace us all. But it is going to give us new conversational partners, new intellectual partners in the way we do science, because they're not going to be like us. If you think about the classic AI test, all right, and Larry, this is for you because I haven't cursed yet. If you think about what the classic AI test is this computer program intelligent? It's the Turing test, okay? So you ask the program questions by typing at it. They called them teletypes in those days. And it gives you answers. And Turing was actually interesting. So he started off as an imitation game between men and women. So can you get a man to try and imitate a woman well enough to fool judges so they couldn't tell? And then can you substitute a computer in for the man? So it's really interesting. It all gets elided. Now it's just, can you tell it's a person or not? But it would be really easy to tell if it's a person, right? What's the first question I would ask if I were a Turing test judge? Tell me about losing your virginity. All of you can answer that, right? And if you can't answer that question, then you have an idea about what it'll be like. But no computer program's going to care. They don't know anything about that. That would be an easy way to tell a program from a person. But that's okay. I don't want to build an artificial person. I want to build a program worth talking to. Okay? And the fact that it doesn't have all those social experiences and human stuff, that's fine. But it's going to be interesting to talk to about molecular biology because it can read those millions of papers and imbibe all those databases. And I can't. I'm lucky if I read 250 papers a year. Okay, there's 1 million papers a year being published in biology these days. Okay, so I don't know half of that stuff. And if I did, I would probably have better explanations and be a better scientist. So if there's a system I can talk to that could say, oh, you know, the problem you're working on, you should know about this stuff. And here's a possible hypothesis about why you're seeing the thing you do. I would love to have that computer program in my lab. And I think there's applications here in diagnosis for sure, and probably in helping scientists interpret their own results, and probably way beyond biomedicine. We'll have to think about that. So once we build systems that really are good at explaining things, the world is going to change. I guess I want to point out Firestein. I started off by talking about ignorance and how important it is. And it's one of those words like parasite, mine rubs people the wrong way a little bit, but this is a lovely book. So the first piece of Firestein's book is about how important ignorance is to the way scientists think. That question about, well, I don't know, but I think I could figure it out if only I did it this way, the part that we're excited about. And the rest of it is all these case studies of people from everywhere, okay, from mathematics to economics to biology to physics, all talking about what they're ignorant of and what they want to know and the like, and it's totally a fun read. He teaches a class based on this. If you're in New York, you'd probably want to sit in on it. But I've been working with some of the folks, including the philosopher I mentioned, Lindley Darden, to try and get some of these mechanism schemas written down. And Lindley and her collaborator, John Molt, have been writing these things down in natural language. So they build diagrams like this. And this is actually how MSH2 mutations lead to increases in cancer. And the only reason I put this up is I want to point out the black box. Okay, so this is a representation of ignorance. We know pretty well if the unstable microsatellites tend to lead to transformation in carcinoma cells, but we have no idea what the mechanism is there, and we'd like to know. So that's a representation of ignorance. And it's moderately useful. It's a good place to start, but we need to map them into things like this, which are ontologically based representation of causal pathways. Okay, and so we need to be able to get from those people writing down things and circling bubbles and making things to real, fundamentally well-grounded in all the same language that we use to represent the knowledge base, to capture these causal chains and the gaps in them and the like, so that we can try and build these automated explainers. And I want to give you a sense, I've given you things that you could read and understand, that was the purpose of that animation, but I want to give you a sense of how rich this really is and show you some of Tiffany Callaghan's work. And so this is that VEGF question, that query that I showed you the answer of and transformed and stuff like that. This is the real answer, okay? So you can see VEGF and some other, this is the process, the red dots are the processes, and the green dots are proteins. And the blue dots are proteins that interact with the proteins that participate in those processes. And all this yellow stuff is the infrastructure we need to put together to make sure it's logically consistent. So when we integrate all this information from the literature and those databases, the first question I get, and study section usually stops at this point, is, well, the literature is full of mistakes. Okay, there's contradictions in there, there's stuff that's wrong. If you kind of put all that stuff in a knowledge base, it'll be worthless. And so what we've done is come up with a very careful logical representation that allows us to take incompatible things and put them together in a logically compatible way. And so if somebody says protein A does X and somebody else says protein A doesn't do X, we can represent that by saying, well, some protein A does X and some protein A does not do X, and they can live in the same representation, and we can always use that denotes link, that information artifact stuff, to see who said it and where and maybe in what context and the like. But in order to try and do inference on this stuff, to try and figure out new explanations, to try and show people what's going on, we want to project out all that logical stuff that we had to be so careful to do so we don't get contradictions, and just make networks that are more useful to people either visualizing things, the one on the right here, or for automated inference, doing a different kind of machine learning techniques. So we've spent a lot of time doing network learning, which is not the same thing as the neural network things. I know terminology is confusing. But it's things like trying to figure out if a whole bunch of things are connected to each other and there's some that are lightly connected, should they really be connected to the rest? Finding communities. It's kind of like what Amazon does or Netflix does to try and recommend things that you might like. And so we find things that might like each other in these big network diagrams. And the idea is to be able to get to the proper representation for inference. And so the right representation for getting what's known down is different than the right representation for thinking about what comes next and what the possible explanation of your experimental results are. And so we're trying to bridge those gaps. There is no one right representation internally in a computer of all of biology. And it's just the way different people conceive of biology, and it's why it's fun to collaborate with people from different kind of subfields than yours, because they understand things differently. And that sort of having them butt up against each other is often very productive. So I don't mean to say that the representation we built in our knowledge base is the right one, but it's a consistent logical basis for making different re-representations of that data that'll be useful for different kinds of inference. So that's sort of where we stand. And I know I'm between you and lunch, and what I want to do is answer questions that you have, but also give you some fodder for your lunch conversations. So I have two suggestions. So one is thinking about those very first things I showed you, okay? We take these deep learning things that are good at cardiac risk scores or good at diagnosing retinopathy in diabetics or the like. How can we actually deploy those things in such a way that we change medicine for the good of patients? Okay? We live in this very complicated ecosystem of payers and gatekeepers and self-care abilities or lack of resources. How can we take these scalable, cheap bits of medical knowledge and disperse them properly throughout our society in such a way that it really actually benefits people instead of the people who own these algorithms or insurers or whomever else? And I think that that's the kind of question this community is really good at wrestling with, and I'd love to hear from you about what you think about that. And then I want to take on that other question. So suppose we did this. Suppose we had an AI system that was capable of explaining its thinking, or at least helping you interpret some of your molecular biomedical data. How would that change what you did? How would that open up new avenues to you? How would you want to take advantage of the ability to reach very deeply into the literature and touch on areas that you didn't know so much about in your own work? How could we properly go fishing together, us and these programs? And I also want to acknowledge that this is much harder than it looks. You could substitute these days, this is an old XKCD. If you substituted big data for algorithms, this would be more current. But it's basically, I want to be a little bit honest about how far we have to go and how primitive our tools are at the moment. I'm proud of what we've been able to do, and I think that it really is getting to the point where it's useful, but I do want to not oversell this and make sure that you're aware that the problems remain difficult in explaining biological and biomedical phenomena, and that these AI systems are going to help us, but not solve those problems for us. All right, with that, I would love to take your questions, and I appreciate your attention. How about in the... You want to give, yeah, Boris.
Larry, as usual, and really engaging talk. But the issue that I'd like to bring up is the data itself. And if you think about AI and using these millions of publications, I also have experienced the fact that a lot of these publications come where the money is. So cancer research becomes our model for biology. Would you like to comment about the relationship of the wealth of data in particular areas and how that can influence the way we view the world through AI?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Boris is right. The biomedical literature is hugely biased in all kinds of ways, both interesting and less so. So we don't study all biological phenomena equally. The biological phenomena we pay attention to, we don't cover the potential explanations or the experiments we might do equally. We're biased by where the money is, where the impact might be, where the new things might be. There's all kinds of reasons the literature is the way it is. And I think that's in some ways more of a problem for Casey's style of work, where you're training up a neural network that can accidentally recapitulate those biases, than it is in this kind of work where we're really trying to get what is there out there and what are the patterns in what's out there for the way we build explanations. And one of the nice things about the explanation question, and human beings are particularly good at this, is when you get a new explanation in your head, you only need one example of it. Okay, the sort of neural network machine learning is about taking tens of thousands of examples and detecting patterns in them. This more symbolic stuff, which I said briefly, is, I think, ready to have a resurgence. All the neural network stuff, just as an aside, all the neural network stuff, the techniques we used, were developed in the 1980s. But we thought they didn't work because our computers were so small and slow, we couldn't do anything except trivial problems. But now, fast forward 40 years, computers are a lot faster and a lot bigger, and this stuff works just fine if you have enough data and enough cycles. Also in the 1980s, we had these symbolic approaches to doing things and in the AI world, and they have largely been cast aside as being impractical toy problem things. But I think the scope of the computing that we have, and now especially the scope of the knowledge we can represent, might turn that corner in symbolic computing as well. And in those symbolic areas, one good example is enough to change the way you think about a lot of the world. So it might be the case that if we could really do this, we could take that niche little publication in some area that's in, oh, I don't know, alcoholism research, that really has wide-ranging implications across a great deal of medicine and recognize those in a way that isn't going to happen in our current community way of reading each other's articles and figuring out what's important.
Larry, that was jaw-droppingly interesting. Thank you very much indeed. But we've got two domains here. One is the research domain, what's going on, and the other is the medicine domain, what to do about what's going on. And when you move into the second domain, all kinds of factors that aren't easily represented molecularly come in. Doctors are pattern recognizers. They recognize much more than the gene mutations that are printed out on the sheet. Can you move into that domain?
The only way we'll ever be able to move into that domain is with causal theories, with explanatory theories. So the reason that these AI machine learning things are good at diagnostics and nowhere else in medicine is because diagnosis really is recognizing patterns. But therapy is about changing things. It requires a causal theory. I can't just say, well, I've seen patterns here where if I observe this, then I get this better outcome, because it might have been unrelated to the cause of the outcome. And so one of the reasons that docs are not going to be replaced by computers anytime soon is they have causal theories in their head that allow them to pick appropriate treatments given that context. And if we develop computational systems that had causal theories, they'd be much better at coming up with treatment recommendations than current machine learning approaches are. But I still think, for the reason that you point out, that they're never going to replace human doctors in dealing with human patients, because part of that is the relationship. Part of that is trust. And part of that is feeling understood. Part of that is just being seen and touched.
So, Larry, Jamie, I'm going to be a little heretical and ask a challenging question, especially in this room, I think. So, do we need to know why?
Yeah.
No, but I want to challenge you on that a little bit for a second, and let me explain why.
Not always.
Because you know, at the end, if you're talking about, as Phyllis said, moving the population back from the precipice and moving them to the center where it's safe, I don't know that we need to know why. I think we need to move them. And one of the things that I'm concerned about insisting on explanation at each moment in time, is that at some level it limits our ambition. It limits our, it limits our ambition. And I think we should maybe ask the question, what is the real goal? If the real goal is to move back from the precipice, that is the end game. You know, your second question here, I don't know if it cares how my research is done. I care if it changes moving people back from the precipice.
Okay. Well, that's reasonable, and I don't mean to argue that everything needs to be explained all the time. First of all, people don't really do that. We have this illusion of explanatory depth, but again, if you push people the way psychologists often meanly do, you can find your level of causal explanation of your world is really not nearly as deep as you think it is. So that's okay. We don't have to explain everything all the time. And it is fine to be able to observe correlations of things based on experience that you have no idea what the explanation is. Okay, I would not send a physicist out to strike out a batter. I'd want a pitcher. Okay, I want the one who's got the more experience, and there's no explanation there. It just is pick the right one, and so that's fine. There's a role for that too. Correlational analyses are perfectly useful and might be useful for some of the goals of improving community health, maybe. But I have to say that if science has mattered at all in improving health, and there are, I suppose, a few people here who might argue that it hasn't, but I think most of us believe that our scientific understanding of the world has been a major driver in our ability to improve health. That is all about why and causation and mechanistic theories. So it's only part of the story, but it's a really important part.
But I have to add something to this. Let me go back to your pitcher versus the physicist analysis. If I were about to play baseball on Mars, the pitcher would be useless.
Maybe.
No, until he had a lifetime of practice, right.
No, not even a lifetime. So maybe the transfer learning thing that Casey was talking about works.
This would know right away what the major issues were.
There you go. How about something who hasn't said anything yet? Huh? Right there.
Yeah, great idea.
Brief comment and questions on why. Well, I'm a cancer epidemiologist. I can just say this is a big debate. Whenever in the history, in the past century, epidemiology has identified a risk factor for cancer. The big question was, is it real or is it spurious association? The historical example is aromatic amines that were used to produce dyes. There were the studies done in the 30s, the 50s, showing that workers in the dye factories had a very high frequency of bladder cancer. Nobody believed it because all the experiments on carcinogenicity were done using rodents. Rodents have a different mechanism of eliminating aromatic amines that are not via glucuronidation and liberation in the bladder. Then somebody had the idea of using dogs. And then with dogs, they were able to produce bladder cancer with aromatic amines in the animals. Therefore, that was a turning point. Oh, this is real. Therefore, we must regulate the use of aromatic amines in industry. So, there is the big debate is what is the evidence that is sufficient to intervene in, for example, in public health. The other one is noise. I really liked what you said. And I think that we really swipe under the carpet what we don't know. I've been really breaking my head against the wall of why being overweight reduces the risk of breast cancer before menopause. This is something that nobody is willing to discuss. It has been shown around the planet by more than 40 big studies, but because it's so embarrassing to say that being overweight reduces your risk of menopause, of breast cancer by 15–20%, that people don't work on it, because it's noise. So I think it's extremely important that we say what we don't know. I really loved your presentation. Thank you.
Have a question in the back?
Yeah, sure. Right back there. I don't think, yes. Observational studies are really important because there's not, some interventions are unethical to do in human beings. So we really have to pay attention to those observational studies. But we have been deeply fooled repeatedly in very significant ways by observational studies. So the requirement for real believable causal mechanism for our even very high correlations is not an unreasonable desire before we make big changes in society. Yeah.
Hi, so great talk, I love this. My name is Greg Lagana, I'm from New Jersey. I am a retired internist, and being an internist, I've been very concerned about clinical decision-making and how you make diagnoses, where the rubber meets the road. All right, so I was fascinated by your story of being treated for dog bites overseas where they knew exactly what to do, but in Harvard they did not. All right, so when I used to teach this, I used to teach my students, you will never make a diagnosis you don't think of, and you will never think of a diagnosis you've never seen, right? So in essence, for me, as a sort of a biocomputer, I need lots of experience of a particular thing to come up with my heuristic algorithm of how I'm going to approach something, right? So one of the first things you learn in diagnosis is when you hear hoofbeats, don't think of zebras, which means that common things are common, all right? The counter to that was by a professor of medicine named Dr. Lawrence Weed. Anybody here remember Larry Weed?
Yeah, he's still around.
Yeah, Larry Weed. I actually, with a friend of mine, tried to write a business plan for his problem knowledge coupler diagnostic support software back in the late 80s and early 90s. Larry Weed essentially believed that you only needed maybe 9 or 10 pieces of data to vote for a diagnosis. So he was sort of like a minimalist approach to the whole thing in his coupler thing. You know, I ask this many questions, I get this many votes, and it makes it, and what it does is it gives me as an internist a list of zebras. You know, if you don't think of zebras, you'll miss the zebras that go by every once in a while. You'll never make a diagnosis you don't think of, you'll never think of a diagnosis you've never seen. Well, here's a tool that lets you do it, and I don't need to input millions of pieces of data into a system, you know, to help me with that. That's him, all right? The other thing is the way that I ended up here 2 years ago, and some of you know that my partner Barry Levy and I did this musical comedy we're going to sing a song a little bit later, was thanks to Steve Pollack, who saw our show in Boston at a meeting of the American Telemedicine Association. And the American Telemedicine Association had partnered with the X Prize Foundation. The X Prize Foundation, founded by Richard Branson, gives out $10 or $20 million prizes to teams that solve difficult problems. And they had a joint project to develop the first tricorder. Tricorder, Star Trek, tricorder. And they had specific criteria for it. It needed to weigh less than 5 pounds. It could be in multiple pieces. It needed to be able to diagnose 15 different medical conditions without the intervention of a medical professional. And it needed to upload in real time five vital signs to a cloud, right? So I'm sort of sitting there, and I don't know anybody's watching the TV program Silicon Valley now, but the hero of that has now decided that he's going to reinvent the internet because everybody on the planet has a friggin' smartphone. And I'm sort of sitting there and saying, so I can plug my smartphone into your, supercomputer that can basically, I can put the smartphone up to your eye and look at your retina, and the thing says, watch out for him, he's got diabetic retinopathy. And all of a sudden I'm like going, oh, thank you, I'm not that good with an ophthalmoscope, because we never use that much, Confiteor Deo. That would be an incredibly useful tool to me, and I find myself wondering, at what point do we as physicians start having the ability to plug our smartphones into, I'll say Watson just for the sake of a supercomputer. He doesn't like Watson. I'm sorry, I don't want to even go there. But to an AI like you're describing. So that's, but it seems to me there's these two approaches. Larry Weed's minimalist approach, all right, versus, let's have a supercomputer that can input millions and millions and millions of pieces of data, analyze it, and then have me have access to it in real time. So those are my thoughts and comments.
Thank you for those.
Okay.
Do you have any
Yeah,
reaction?
I'll make a very small addendum to that. So Larry Weed is a really interesting guy. He's the guy who more or less invented the SOAP note, right? The way doctors document their stuff. That was his idea of how to organize the notes. And his claims these days are that we are failing to capture phenotype properly in our patients. So we don't document what's really going on with them. We only document what's necessary to avoid losing a lawsuit. And so if we did document what's really going on with our patients, then that data would be much more useful, both for research and for automated kinds of interventions of various kinds. And so that plays a role in calls, where we're trying to think about how to phenotype the people we are taking care of. And I'll tell one brief funny story. When I was got my first job at the National Library of Medicine, the director of the National Library of Medicine at the time was a rheumatologist, and so there was this project to do a rheumatology expert system called AI Room. And I came in as the machine learning guy, and they said, well, can you try doing a machine learning version of this and see if it's any better? And it turned out that the best machine learning system for taking these patient records and predicting rheumatologic diagnosis was based on the tests that were ordered. And in fact, it didn't matter to the machine learning system if it knew the results of the tests. And in fact, you could do the inverse and take the tests that weren't ordered, and it was just as good at predicting the diagnosis. Okay, and so that means the patient record is really reflecting clinical thinking and some defensiveness and various other, and reimbursement, much more than it is reflecting a description of our patients. And I think what Larry was trying to get at, Wall, is trying to get at in his things is if we did a better job of reflecting what the patients actually brought to us in the record, we'd do a better job as doctors.
Okay, I'm going to stop at this point. Lunch is there. Larry, thank you very much. Thank the other three speakers for a great